Retro. Go. Vital. We're go fly. Guidance. Guidance go. Launch control, this is Houston. We are go for launch.
I feel the need.
And first, Ryer, why don't you tell everybody what the best way to get a hold of us if they wish to reach out to us on social media platforms.
Well, contrary to common belief, the best way is not carrier pigeon. It is actually on our social media, which is Mark Ruppy Outdoors on Facebook, Mark Ruppy Outdoors on Instagram, or you can email us, markruppyoutdoors@gmail.com. And of course, you can find all of our stuff on our website, www.markruppyoutdoors.com.
Do we have a porn site yet?
Mark Ruppy Outdoors xxx.org.
.johnson.
.johnson.
Yeah. Anyways, on a separate note, in our real business today we're going to talk about arrows and in your archery setups and what we can do to improve our lethality in our hunting. And this became apparent to me on a few hunts where I've had some things that I couldn't quite explain. Now I shoot 70 pounds. I shoot a 30-inch arrow where, it should theoretically, it's probably 450 grains or something. Theoretically should be whistling through everything. But every once in a while I was getting these darn things I couldn't explain. I was actually hitting the side of a deer and the arrow exiting the same side of the deer, just hitting and raking along the ribs and going out. I was having, I shot one doe in New York with a second shot, a finishing up shot, and she was about 35 yards away, and I hit her in the scapula, and it hardly penetrated at all. And all these things are getting me thinking, going, what is going on? It should have enough horsepower to be going through all these critters, but yet, and many times I would. Everything was favorable, and that's a key thing when everything is favorable. But when everything favorable and the stars lined up right, and the animal stopped broadside at 20 yards, and I had a nice clean shot at the broadside at the ribs, everything went hunky dory. But when things didn't go right, when the angle wasn't quite right, or like I say, it was a follow-up shot, things all of a sudden weren't working out how I had hoped. And so I got into this Facebook group, High Momentum, and I started checking out some of the posts and conversations with some of the people, and finding out what it was going to take to get a little better performance. And through that search, I ran into our guest today, Jake Thompson of Danger Close Outdoors, and he is with us, and he's going to walk us through some different things about how we can improve our arrow setup. So, Jake, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you letting me join in.
First, Jake, what's if people want to look you up on Danger Close? What's just the best way to do that?
The best bet, in all honesty, is hit me up on Facebook, Danger Close Outdoors, and go ahead and shoot me a message if you got any questions, and we'll be happy to help you get set up and get you taken care of.
Okay, all right. So typically, like with rifles and everything, for most of us deer hunters, it's always been about kinetic energy, and then with archery, it's been about kinetic energy. Excuse me, hold on. What's that, Ryer?
I thought we were going to talk about the elephant thing, Mark.
Oh, you want to talk about elephants first?
Yeah,
we can tie that up at the end as well.
Okay,
however you guys want to do it.
Okay, well, Ryer has had a little trouble with his potty training, so we get things out of order, and he's going to have to go all millennial on us. So, either way, let's talk about let's go all elephants. So elephants have been in the news, and they certainly take high momentum to shoot with archery. But I heard about restoring the importing of elephant parts into the United States. And can you clarify, Jake, what that means to us or what's happening?
So currently, one of the things that they're looking at doing is allowing the importation of elephants that have been harvested since the ban. The ban was originally introduced when the whole Cecil incident took off, and it was kind of an illogical ban. The reason why it was an illogical ban is we didn't ban the hunting of them. We didn't ban things to be where you could not harvest them. So all we did was ban the legal importation of an animal that was legally harvested in a country that it was legal to harvest it in. All too often, I think most people get hunters or trophy hunters and poachers kind of confused, and they lump them into one group, and that's truly not the case.
And I'm sure the anti-hunters, they're hoping, well, if the hunters can't bring back any parts of them, they just will hopefully just not even go hunting.
The unfortunate thing is when we start to ban the importation of those trophies that were legally harvested in a country that it's legal to harvest them in, we end up creating a situation where now if those individuals don't go out and hunt them, those animals lose value. By the trophy hunting mindset and how things are actually done, those animals have value to the local individuals, so therefore they become protected, and those local individuals see actual dollar signs on them, and they're worth more to them alive than they are dead. So when we start banning all that stuff, we actually start shifting it the other direction. And the Zimbabwe is the perfect example. When the ban created a lack of business and a lack of opportunity and value of those live animals, poaching actually increased throughout the whole entire region.
So it's that vacuum's got to go somewhere. So if the hunters weren't taking them and they didn't see the value, then the poachers saw, all of a sudden they saw the value. They could reap the benefit of it. And was there? I know some places where there hasn't been hunting, there's been drastic population. I mean, there's kind of a conflict of things. There's some places there's giant increases in them, and then they can't withstand the pressure that the animals can't, the habitat can't stand the pressure that the animals put on it. And then there's also I mean, the case of some rhinos and stuff like that, or other trophy species, they're taking too much of. So I'm kind of not phrasing it that well there, but there's kind of a balance, I guess, is what I'm saying, that hunting puts in there with the population and the value of the animals.
Oh, very much so. For example, if you turn around and you look at South Africa, where trophy hunting is allowed, however, not for elephant, for export, you look at their situation currently, they roughly have, and don't quote me on the numbers, but about 83,000 elephant that are within the South African region. Their ecosystem is only able to really sustain about 50,000 plus or minus a couple, according to the biologists. Where when you turn around and you look at Kenya banned all trophy hunting back in 1977. And between now and then, throughout all species, they suffer between a 72% and 88% loss in numbers throughout the whole entire region. And mostly because those animals don't have value. So the individuals in a local area just kill them off. I know that a lot of people don't like it, but the reality is they're exotic animals to us because we don't live there. Those individuals that live there, it's an everyday animal that they see and that cause drastic problems throughout the regions. And those animals that we do hunt, those tribes, those locals, or on that section have already been allocated to harvest X amount of animals each year. Whether we like it or not, those animals are going to be dispatched and going to be taken. What we're doing by the trophy hunting industry is allowing the animal to have more value than just to be taken throughout that region. That brings a massive amount of money into the area. It can support villages, doctors, schools, and several other things by just making it so that an individual is able to pay the money to go ahead and come in there.
Mm-hmm. And so right now, is it restored? Can hunters bring back?
Right now, it got a little bit interesting. It's currently on hold. A letter's been sent out to the president by the president of the Safari Club International, and we're currently waiting on a response. We're just waiting to see and get everything ironed out. The reality is the ban that Trump was lifting was not a ban on hunting. It was a ban on animals that were dispatched during the 2000, basically from when Cecil got shot until now. Mm-hmm. So those animals have already been shot and dispatched. It's just allowing those individuals to go ahead and import those trophies back into the United States. It really doesn't change anything as far as whether the animals are alive or dead.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much for clearing that up. So back onto our arrow quest for a better arrow setup. I said in the past, I'd always looked at kinetic energy being the value that I wanted to have in my arrow. And it was because I just hunted light skin game with my rifles. Same, pretty much with my rifles, my 243 or my 270. They had sufficient kinetic energy. That was fine. Well, tell us what the difference between kinetic energy and momentum is, and why this momentum thing is important.
So one of the things that is most oftenly misunderstood is the kinetic energy versus momentum. Bullets and arrows kill animals in completely different manners. A bullet kills an animal via hydrostatic shock and cavitation, where an arrow kills an animal via hemorrhagic, by basically creating a wound where the blood loss is so great that the animal ends up dying. A bullet with the kinetic energy, it's able to identify a little bit more of the lethality of the round based upon the kinetic energy, because that directly correlates to the hydrostatic shock and the cavitation that is created by the bullet. With the arrow, it equals the hemorrhagic. So what ends up happening is in archery, because it's completely the other way, where the hemorrhagic and being able to create that blood loss is so great, and that is the number one reason why the animals end up dying, is that the arrows getting a complete pass through is absolutely vital. For archery, the kinetic energy shows nothing more than the efficiency of the bow and how well it casts the arrow. Where you start to transfer to lethality is directly related to momentum. Hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah. So, with that momentum, we're able to carry or drive that arrow through bone, through hide, through meat, muscle, lung tissue, out the other side. So when I mentioned my scapula shot that just kind of penetrated a couple inches and then fell out, how does that momentum equation help me versus kinetic energy?
So the momentum shows you more of how hard it is to actually stop that arrow and how much inertia that arrow actually has going forward. Where that kinetic energy, as soon as impact is met, there is no more kinetic energy. Kinetic energy does not actually have a direction, where momentum has that forward motion to it. So it comes down to simple physics.
I see. So when we can measure that momentum increase, we can definitely correlate that to how far that arrow is going.
You can start to correlate it. It becomes a little sticky at times because there's many other factors that play into it.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about some of those factors, and I don't know if you're referring to the Ashby 12 factors of penetration. Let's go over a couple of them. It's a lot of them to deal with, maybe in this short of a podcast. But let's take a top few of them. And what's the number one issue or the number one factor in penetration?
So the number one factor in penetration is structural integrity. Once your arrow starts to break apart, whether it's the point breaking, the ferrule breaking, or the arrow itself breaking, all penetration from that point is lost. So you need to take into account that it needs to hold together to get all the way through that animal. That is always going to be your number one, no matter what else goes on.
Okay. So, and that's tip curl, that's everything, anything that's going to impede the progress or make that arrow take a new direction or anything.
Yes, sir. Even as much as a 1/16 of an inch tip curl can diminish your penetration capabilities of 14%.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were going to get in there and get all the way through them, now just that tip slightly curling can actually rob you of that full pass through and keep it inside that animal.
Okay. What's the second factor?
So number 2 is going to be arrow flight. When you're talking about this one, it means perfect arrow flight. That butt end of the arrow or the knock end of the arrow must be directly behind the front end of the arrow or the point upon impact. If it is not directly behind that point, what happens is something called impact paradox or impact flex. And that back end wants to move around to the side. And once it starts to move around to the side, that robs your energy and your inertia, and it drives it a different direction and tries to force the point to the side. If that ends up happening, you can actually diminish your penetration or completely stop it. This is actually one of the number one reasons why arrows actually break on an animal.
Is because they were not flying straight they were not contacting that animal straight.
Exactly. So because that front and that back end weren't contacting that animal perfectly in line, that back end moves to the side, which creates a weak point directly behind the insert.
Okay. All right. And number 3, what's the third factor?
The third factor is going to be the degree of FOC, or the front of center, that an arrow has. So basically what the front of center is the amount of weight that is forward of the center of the arrow, and it's measured in a percentage. Because it's measured in a percentage from the halfway point, it can never be above 50%. The more that you have the weight in front of the center, so the more total weight of your arrow that is toward the front end, the more that your arrow is able to stabilize, penetrate better, and also it's just going to increase the structural integrity due to the fact that that front end is forcing that back end to follow it. The easiest example of this is take a dart. If a dart was perfectly weighted out, equal throughout the whole entire thing, when you threw that dart, it would tumble through the air. Mm-hmm. The reason that dart flies perfect is because the amount of weight that is up front automatically corrects the path of that dart and sends it toward the direction and what you actually intended to throw it at.
Yeah, I guess, and you can go to even more extreme example, those lawn darts where just all the weight's out in front and just everything just follows. I mean, where that head's going, that everything else follows straight behind it.
Exactly. And where this really comes into play too is not just the penetration, but it develops a more forgiving arrow as long as all other factors are equal and you have perfect flight, which is meaning the perfect spine of your arrow and everything is tuned. Once you have that, the FOC is going to help diminish the amount of force and the amount of impact per se that the wind is going to have if you have a crosswind. So you're not going to have your arrow drift nearly as much to the side.
Okay. So that wind drift, that's actually helped with FOC. Because to me, it would have seemed like weight would be an issue. Wind would have a harder time moving the weight, but even with the FOC, that's still true with the wind, huh? All things being equal. Okay.
With all things being equal, so the front end is heading toward the target. So even if you get an erratic flight, even if you torque your bow a little bit, If you have a high FOC arrow, it is going to be closer to your intended impact point than it will be if you had a low FOC arrow.
Okay. Well, give us another one. What's the next one on your list as far as importance?
The next one on the list is going to be mechanical advantage. So this starts to talk about where or how the broadhead itself is designed and the way the blade angles actually are. So your shorter, squattier broadheads that have a wider cut have a lower mechanical advantage than if you've got a longer broadhead that has a longer ferrule and a longer blade with the same width. Easiest way to think about it is if you turn it sideways and you create a ramp with those blades, think of it as a wheelchair ramp. If you're trying to push that individual in the wheelchair up the ramp with an extremely steep slope, it becomes very, very difficult. But if it's a longer ramp that has a lower degree of angle, it's going to be easier to do. When you impact that animal, that blade is having to cut and force everything apart and out of the way. That ramp is going to basically ensure that you diminish the amount of energy that is lost by that arrow.
Okay. So those type of heads will be, and I know you sell and represent Grizzly Stick products, but the Samurai head is a good example of something with a high mechanical advantage. And,
yes, sir.
And then your mechanicals that have a very wide cut in a short distance. Those are the I guess you would call the opposite of mechanical advantage.
Correct. And then not only that, but the mechanical broadheads are a whole different end of the world where now you have to start looking at the loss of energy just to make them open. Mm-hmm. And that adds a whole nother factor into the entire thing.
Okay. And if hitting something hard or rigid with one blade and one blade opens different than another blade, I imagine some of those arrows can take a pretty radical turn.
Yes, sir. It goes back into, it almost falls back into rule number one with the structural integrity, because not everything is hitting equal. If only one blade opens, it's almost as bad as a tip curl or a blade deviation at that point. And it's going to shift that arrow and it's going to rob that forward momentum and it's going to shift that back into the side as well.
Mm-hmm. So, talk to us about bow tuning, because I would imagine as we start shooting these larger fixed blade heads now, I think one of the reasons people have shied away from in the past is they just wanted to take a bow off the shelf, put a small a mechanical head or small cut on contact sort of head, short, small profile head, and get good flight, and then not have to worry about any mistakes their bow might be giving them. Can you talk to us a little bit about bow tuning and some things that people can look to do real quick or get their pro shop to do quick to get them things lined up right?
So one of the biggest things that you look at is everybody's really hung up on the paper tune. The paper tune is just a start. The easiest way to look at a paper tune is think of very macro and you're trying to get down to micro. When you paper tune a bow with a field point, it can be on point and shooting a bullet hole, but that doesn't mean your bow is fully tuned. If you were getting erratic flight with a fixed blade broadhead, but you're getting perfect flight with a field point or with a mechanical broadhead, your bow is still not tuned. You're just masking it and creating an issue that is just waiting to bear its ugly little head. So if it masks it and the arrow isn't perfectly tuned with that mechanical blade, and as you spoke about earlier, that lack of mechanical advantage and the tip curl and several other things that can come into play, all you're doing is hiding it. And then that way when you hit the animal and it doesn't pass through, you're completely baffled and lost. There should be no rock not turned, or however you want to word it, that you, well, let's correct ourselves there. You should do everything you can in every way possible to make sure that your bow is perfectly tuned no matter what to the setup that you have. If you can't get it there, then you need to go back to the drawing board and either change your arrows or change your design or figure out what's going on.
All right, and I guess that gets back to that second principle is perfect arrow flight.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, let's go over another one. What's the next one down the line?
So the next one down the line is the shaft diameter ferrule. So where this comes into play is when you start looking at broadheads, especially with the micro diameter broadheads now where they've got a really skinny ferrule, and you have a shaft that is bigger than the ferrule, which is the main part of the broadhead that holds the blades. That creates that little step up right there, and you feel that ridge on that transfer from the ferrule to the arrow shaft. Mm-hmm. If you feel that ridge there, the slightest increase in that can actually rob your arrow penetration capability by up to about 40%, depending on how drastic it is.
Okay, so just that hide just dragging heavier across that arrow as opposed to flowing freely over it, huh?
Exactly. So for an extreme example, let's say you take a Easton Fat Boy shaft that is a big target shaft, and you put a normal little micro broadhead on it, such as the Rocket Ultimate Steel. Those two don't combine very well, and they don't complement each other. So it creates a massive amount of drag on the front end of that arrow. So even though your broadhead might be fine and you might be passing through that animal, that ridge line that is created by that insert in the sheer diameter of the shaft creates a massive amount of drag and just completely impedes your arrow performance.
All right, well, give us another one. What's the next down the line? Looks like we'll get through all of these here.
Let's see here. So the next one is going to be arrow mass. So basically what it comes down to is the pure arrow mass goes down to the weight of the arrow. The heavier the arrow, the more momentum it's going to carry, the harder it is that it's going to be to stop. And no matter what your setup is, when all other factors are equal, the heavier arrow will always outpenetrate the lighter arrow on animals.
Mm-hmm. So I guess an extreme example would be a ping pong ball versus a golf ball about the same diameter, but if you started throwing those at some milk jugs or bowling pins or something like that ping pong ball, even though your arm can really accelerate as you're throwing it, as soon as it leaves your hand, there's nothing to hold that energy that your arm had stored into it, as opposed to that golf ball that I guess we say carries your energy or carries your momentum with it.
Correct. You're 100% on target there. And that's where, if you take a perfect test for people to do at home, is if you got a slingshot floating around, go ahead and shoot a ping pong ball out of a slingshot and then shoot a golf ball out of a slingshot. And if you really want to see the difference and figure out whether or not which one you put more value in, hand that slingshot to somebody else and let them shoot a ping pong ball at you, or let them shoot a golf ball at you. I guarantee you're not going to let them shoot the golf ball at you.
I was going to say, I guarantee that's just not going to happen. Okay. All right. Next one. What do we got? I don't know what number we're on here. What number are we on?
We were on 6. Number 7 is going to be edge finish. And that gets into whether or not it is an extremely sharp, straight edge, smooth, like surgical sharp stropped blade, or whether or not we're talking about serration, or whether or not we're talking something that's just somewhat sharp with a 600 grit hone. And that starts to play a huge, huge factor into it. So when all other factors are equal, an edge finish can have up to a 60%. Let me rephrase that there. If you have a extremely sharp, stropped finish that is surgical, you will have a 26% advantage over any other type of standard head. However, if you've got a serrated edge, you've got a 60% difference that actually plays into effect, and it starts to impede your penetration capability. Not only that, when you start to hit bone, a serrated edge can completely and totally rob your penetration capability, and it'll hang up right there. The other disadvantage that a serrated edge has is you will actually decrease the amount of blood loss in the animal. And part of that is due to the tearing of the capillaries and the arteries that it passes through. So instead of slicing it perfectly thin, when it rips it apart, it actually tears and stretches it, and it has a tendency to close back down. So with identical shots, a serrated edge will usually produce less blood than a perfectly straight stropped finish or stropped edge.
Now that since they do kill by bleeding to death, that besides the penetration factor, that razor's edge as it nicks and touches and slices through everything is a huge factor in whether arrow glides past an artery or whether it lacerates that artery.
Very, very much so. And then it gets a little bit crazier as well. So when you start thinking about, never mind, disregard that comment. I completely foobarred that one. So we'll carry on.
Okay. Okay, next one down the line.
So next one down the line goes into shaft profile. And this one is something that's very, very interesting and a lot of people don't realize. And even the head engineer of Easton has got a whole write-up on the Easton website all about it. And it talks about the different shaft profiles. And what we're talking about is there's a parallel shaft, which all the sides of the arrow are perfectly straight, and it's a perfectly straight line. There's a tapered shaft where the front end is bigger and it gets skinnier toward the back. And then there's one called a barrel shaft. And a barrel shaft bubbles in the middle and is usually used in target archery for recurves or longbow competitions. When it comes down to shaft profile, the parallel shaft, the main reason it is so popular is it is the easiest to go ahead and manufacture and the cheapest to manufacture. The tapered arrow shaft is extremely difficult, extremely expensive to manufacture, but it is far beyond any other shaft in all capabilities as far as penetration. Not only that, it increases your FOC significantly just by the pure design, where it's going to be bigger up front with more of its weight up front, and then it continually tapers off in the back.
Okay. All right. Next one. What do we got?
So the next one is going to be broadhead and arrow silhouette. And basically what that talks about is the smoothness of the transitions and the slickness from the blade on up to the ferrule and how it's actually designed overall. If it is a bulbous, square, or extremely rounded edge, so that blade comes up and it creates a really high point, especially on the front of that ferrule on the cut-on contact heads, it creates a, I'm drawing a blank on how to word it. It basically impedes the penetration due to it not having a smooth transition and creating more resistance throughout.
So that's some of those heads that start kind of going, have a real fine angle of attack, then all of a sudden swoop out or something like that almost.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. I know. And why don't you hit on our last ones? Why don't you, because I got a few more things I want to cover with you. Why don't you just real quickly go through the last few things, factors of penetration.
Okay, so type of edge bevel. Type of edge bevel is referring to either double bevel or single bevel. And the double bevel is what almost everybody sees in a standard broadhead nowadays. It's sharpened on both sides of the little blade, and therefore it creates equal pressure on that blade. A single bevel is only sharpened on one side. What that does is it creates a force against that bevel and creates a rotational force that creates a spiral wound channel. As far as penetration capabilities in soft tissue, there is not a significant difference. However, when bone is impacted, the depth of penetration is drastically increased with a single bevel broadhead. And the reason is it creates that spiral force and that rotational force into the bone and breaks the bone and clears it out of the way so the rest of your arrow can pass through.
Oh, okay. All right, next one.
Tip design comes in at, I want to say 11. And what the tip design refers to is either a needle point, a chisel tip, or a Tonto tip. And through all of Dr. Ashby's testings, the Tonto tip has a drastic improvement on penetration capabilities due to the fact that it is least likely to curl, bend, or try and skip and change the angle off a bone.
Okay.
And then the final one comes in at arrow mass above the heavy bone threshold. So the heavy bone threshold for most big animals is 650 grains, no matter what draw weight arrow that you shoot or what draw weight bow that you shoot. The 650 grains is number 12, but when a heavy bone is impacted, it very quickly moves and goes up to about the 4th spot. And mainly because at that point when a shot goes bad and you hit that heavy bone, you need that capability to get through it. Otherwise, all penetration is lost. And that's where it comes down to, for the setup that you described earlier, hitting that deer in the scapula and only getting a couple inches. For your setup, you probably got plenty of lethal shots with your setup beforehand, and it's more than capable on a perfect shot. But now that heavy bone got in the way, now that changed things and reordered those 12 penetration enhancing factors. And now that heavy total arrow mass above that heavy bone threshold became vital and critical to make that shot a lethal shot.
Okay. All right. So on a 650 grain setup versus a 450 grain setup, what at a common shooting distance of 30 yards, what's going to be the difference in trajectory? I know all bows are different, but I mean, can you give us a ballpark? I mean, I kind of know in mine, but from your experiences, what do you see?
I'd probably say a vast majority of my clients at 30 yards with a standard draw length of about 28.5 to 29 inches, they virtually see no difference. There might be a half inch of drop, but that's a real simple gang plate adjustment. And in all honesty, I don't know about you, but I know I can't shoot well enough to truly determine whether or not that's a half inch of drop or I'm just having a bad day.
Well, even at several inches, I don't know if you've watched any whitetail videos or pigs, which I've got a lot of footage of. Even at 20, 25 yards, if they are alert, they will turn even a fast bow's shot from a good shot to a bad shot. I mean, number one thing to me, shooting at relaxed animals, and when you have that, then a lot of times you're hitting what you're aiming at. But if you're shooting at an alert white-tailed deer at 30 yards, you can pretty much bet that animal's vitals are not going to be where they were when you punch the trigger.
Oh, most definitely. And that's where those Plan B arrows come in, and that heavier setup with that higher FOC, that good quality single bevel broadhead, completely and totally can change the game from an animal where you're tracking all the way into the next day, or you only have to go 30 yards to recover it.
Mm-hmm. Now, a controversial subject in archery is that quartering towards you shot, not necessarily that one straight down the pipe, but the one where you might hit the humerus or the scapula is actually, people talking about hitting the scapula, it's actually fairly high on an animal. I guess, and you're up in a tree stand shooting down, that's getting in the way. But if a guy with a 650 grain setup and he's shooting 65 or 70 pounds and shooting that 650 grain arrow, and he's got that quartering towards you shot, what's going to happen to that humerus when he makes contact with that? or scapula?
So the one thing I would add is the FOC above 19%.
Okay.
The reality is at that point, our ethics and what we've always deemed as ethical has always been based on the capability of our equipment that we had. Now that we know the capabilities that we've got and what it takes to go ahead and get through a whitetail, especially a whitetail, that quartering 2-shot, if you have a 650 grain arrow with 19% FOC or higher, a good quality single bevel broadhead, and you have a perfectly tuned bow with that high structural integrity, you're going to get right through them. The rules are basically changing. So you've got that ability to take that quartering 2-shot if you feel comfortable to do it and if you're following all those rules.
Okay. So now let's talk about all those factors going together: better arrow, better broadhead, everything. You sell or represent Grizzly Stick products. Tell us about. They have a new arrow online. What's coming down with that?
So we currently launched the TDT arrow, which is a thin diameter taper. So as we discussed, you've got a tapered arrow that we talked about when we talked about shaft profile. A thinner diameter, which has to do with the overall diameter of the shaft as well, which especially helps on the transfer from the ferrule to the actual arrow itself. It has a 5% FOC, just bare shaft at full length at 31.5 inches without an insert. Once you put the insert-outsert on it, it is upwards of around 8 to 10 just from the start. As soon as you add even a 100 grain broadhead to it, you're looking at the 17% range on up. The capabilities that it brings is it has everything that we talked about as far as arrows are concerned in those 12 penetration enhancing factors. You've got an increased structural integrity. You've got the great profile to it. It's the tapered arrow on top of it all. It's going to be easier to tune, easier to shoot, and you're going to increase your penetration.
Now, I won't go through prices on any of this stuff, but I know from personal experience, a lot of this stuff isn't cheap. But I think there's you really have to look at it as far as value as opposed to price, because these unless you lose them, which I lost one as it sailed through an elk this year and still traveling, but these arrows aren't your garden variety. Broke a bunch of shafts, screwed up a bunch of broadheads. These arrows, as soon as you reuse them all, especially those broadheads, they become half price. And I mean, I know you can get replacement blades for rages and some of those other things, but I still on a hunt, I was never going to gamble. I was always going with a fresh head. These heads, they're how many times do they go through an animal?
Currently, I spoke to a client earlier on this year, and he is on his 27th big game animal with the same identical broadhead and arrow. So one arrow, one broadhead. He hasn't even used the rest of the pack or the rest of the quiver yet, other than to go ahead and target shoot. And he's taken 27 animals with it. By the time that you get done factoring out what that costs for each animal, there's nothing that compares. The most I personally have ever gotten out of one is 13 big game animals, over 125 pounds each. And that was the only reason I'm not currently using it to this day was I lost it. And I about lost my mind trying to find it. You're going to get more use out of these arrows. You're going to have a better result, and you're going to have a better survivability. Yes, it's expensive, but it's more of an investment for long-term goal. And it helps ensure that you've got the capabilities to actually dispatch that animal no matter what really goes on.
So here's something I want to talk about all you hunters from personal experience. So I'm going to go to Colorado elk hunting. I'm going to burn $600 in fuel. I'm going to burn $700 on the tags and license. I'm going to take 10 days off of work and family. I'm going to get food. I've got my tents. I've got everything, and I've got my whole trip online and success once I launch that arrow, all on the line. What is that worth to you? Do you really want to say that you saved $5, $10, or $15 or $50 on your broadheads, and when you've already invested that much in your trip and that much time and everything, and now that all that comes down to your trip is that arrow making contact with the animal. That's all that's left. How much you spent on your bow or anything, that's all left behind. All that your trip is now based on is you punch the trigger. I shouldn't say punch the trigger, but because what I do. But you have gently released the trigger and you made a shot. That's all that's left. All that's left to base your success on your hunt now is that arrow, and going cheap on some of that stuff when you consider how much you've invested in everything else is really a false economy. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, or if I went long-winded enough on that explanation, or.
No, it's a great topic, and it's a topic that we talk about constantly. We have individuals, myself included, that go out and spend $1,400 on a bow, $150 on our quiver. We buy the most expensive rest that we feel can do the job. We buy the best sight that we can get. We buy little custom peep sights and everything else. And we spend buku amounts of money, even down to our stabilizers and what our case is that carries our bow. And then all too often I see individuals go, well, what broadhead and arrow you got? And they respond with, well, whatever was cheapest at the shop. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, the bow is just another means to get the arrow to the target. I'm sure there's some mass bow manufacturers out there that are ready to headhunt me over that. But the reality is it's another means to cast the actual lethal part of the device to that target and that intended game animal. And once it's released, like you said, the only thing that's left and stands between you and a successful hunt is that arrow and that broadhead. And for me, I'm not willing to waste a chance on it.
No, I'm not either, and I have not perfected my journey on this, but it's one I'm certainly enjoying taking, and I've now taken a couple pigs and a couple deer and elk, and right now I'm standing with 100% pass through on all my animals, and I know one thing people have talked about. Well, with the 2-blade arrows, you don't get the blood trail, and I've had the elk I just shot. We had pretty significant blood once we found the trail. I mean, it was a good blood trail that even I could follow.
Which is saying something.
Which is saying something, and I don't think that's a reason why people should be afraid of a 2-blade head. And after all, a rage is only a 2-blade head. So I mean, I guess with that logic, we wouldn't shoot rages either. But is there your thoughts on worrying about blood trails with the 2-blade head? Is that a topic or a thing that you'd worry about at all?
No, sir. The reality is most of my animals, the reason why the blood trail wasn't as significant, as bad as this sounds, was they didn't have time to bleed before they died. We generally, with my equipment that I use, I measure the blood trails in feet versus hundreds of yards. So even if I don't have a blood trail, but my animal is only 20 feet, maybe 30 feet away from where that impact happened, I'm not too worried about it.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, did you got anything Anything else we want to? What do we got, Ryer? Do we got a question on from our Facebook page about someone?
Yes.
Okay. What is our reader question, Ryer?
So this is actually a multiple part question, so we'll just take it one by one. And this is from Isaac, and his last name starts with a J, and I'm not going to try to attempt to pronounce it. It looks easy, but I've fooled myself before. So. He wants to know, how many animals have you not had a pass through on?
Let's see here. We're looking at, don't quote me directly, but I know the last 304 big game animals that I've taken with my bow, I have not achieved a pass through on 1, 2, 3, 4.
Out of how many?
304.
304. Okay, there's a lot of African game there, or European game and everything. I know your travels as a veteran, you've been all over the world.
So we had a hog in the United States, and that was because he had a hill behind him. So it got through him, but it stuck in the dirt behind him as he tried to scurry off. So I'm not going to count that one because it wasn't free flowing and went through him. So I'll go ahead and chalk that one up. A 2,000 pound, barrel bull that we did a hunt on out on one of the large cattle ranches out in Texas. The bull, basically, we turned him out. We thought he was dead. He showed back up about 4 years later. Started coming up the ropes and killing the horses out from underneath the cowboys as we were trying to put them in the pen. So I didn't get a pass through on him. That was my fault. Bad shot, and I chose my arrow very poorly. And then we had a kudu in Africa that I pinned to the ground. I shot it while it was bedding. And I had a water buck that happened to be right beside a rock when I shot it. And so the arrow impacted the rock and never got all the way, clean through out the other side of the animal, zipping off in no land.
Gotcha. What was the other part of that question, Ryer?
Okay, so part 2 of 3 is, what is the longest distance an animal has ran for you after being shot with a single bevel?
With a single bevel? I want to say, let's see here. Single bevel, I'd say, and don't quote me on this, but I'd say about 75 yards.
Okay.
Not counting, I've got 5 wounded and lost animals out of that last, God knows how many animals. Mm-hmm. But out of the ones that I recovered, matter of fact, all the ones that I lost were with a double bevel. So 75 yards on the single bevel broadhead.
All right. Is there another part to that question?
Yep.
Or is that?
There is one last part. Isaac wants to know if there was a point in your life that you shot extremely light and had failures, and if that's the reason why you dove into the Ashby studies.
Not necessarily the reason why I dove into the Ashby studies. I shot a caribou on the tundra. He went about 120 yards, had to go ahead and put a second shot in him. And when I put that second shot in him, I hit that leg bone on that far side, and the arrow stopped. Like there was no, it sounded like a shot from a gun, didn't even crack the leg. It literally stopped dead in its tracks, and that caribou proceeded to go off a little bit further. And at the time, I thought, something, my shot, my bad shot, et cetera, second shot, so just get whatever you can. And it wasn't until I was living in Europe and I was starting to design my setup for Cape Buffalo that I started getting into the Ashby studies. And I started looking back on all my harvests that I'd done throughout the years and started realizing what had happened on each one of my hunts, whether it was unsuccessful or that the arrow didn't penetrate all the way through, and starting to do the math and figure out what I needed to do to go ahead and improve it.
Okay. Well, that's about it for our questions. We just we posted a thing real quick and when I had any questions, we just had one responder there. So, anything else, Ryer, that we had that we wanted to talk about? What is, so tell us about about Danger Close. What is Danger Close Outdoors?
So Danger Close Outdoors was a company we created about 5 years ago, and our main goal in life is to help people get going the right direction on their hunts, their adventures, whatever they want to do. If you're looking for a fishing outfit, if you're looking to go skydiving in Europe, we can help you and help point you in the right direction. Predominantly, we do equipment sales and help people get set up with the right arrows, but we got contacts throughout the world and can help direct you in the right path to go ahead and achieve your dreams and have the time of your life.
All right. That's awesome. So the best way people find you is on Facebook, Danger Close Outdoors on Facebook. And his name is Jake Thompson. And we want to thank you very much today for that hour of time you gave us. We really appreciate that.
Anytime. I appreciate you having me.
All right. Ryer, we got anything else to address here?
Well, I think we got a lot more people commenting on our Facebook post about going bird hunting with you than we got about intelligent questions to be asked on a podcast full of information. And I think we need to address that.
Do we need to scold our listeners or our viewers or something?
I don't know.
It's funny when we offer free stuff how we get more responses than give it. Well, this is free information. People should be all over. But anyways, that's funny how it works. You dangle some hunts out there and people all over you like fat to a mother-in-law. Other than that,
but for those of you who do want to ask questions on Facebook,
you're doing we love our questions, love our viewers. Or do we have viewer or viewers?
I think we can put the S in parentheses.
Okay.
And allow both possibilities.
Viewers. Okay. Anyways, we thank you guys all very much for listening. Ryer, one more time, why don't you tell them how they can listen to us and how they can get a hold of us?
Well, you can find this podcast wherever you're listening to it now, because obviously you've already found it. You can also find our videos on YouTube at Mark Ruppe Outdoors. And, of course, we've got Instagram and Facebook, Mark Ruppe, Grupe Outdoors. And the hub of our online presence is markruppeoutdoors.com.
All right, very good. Well, thank you guys all very much for listening. We want to thank Jake Thompson, Danger Close Outdoors, for giving us an hour of his time, and we hope it's been educational to you guys, and you learned something about it, and you'll start thinking about that as you might want to up your game in your arrows and your broadhead. So we thank you very much for listening, and we will see you next time at Mark Ruppe Outdoors, the podcast.